Okay, so our next presenter, we've already had the pleasure of being introduced to him, Dr. Paul Clough, who is a professor of information retrieval at the Information School, University of Sheffield. And he's going to be talking to us about user-informed design for search and discovery in digital cultural heritage. Please welcome Dr. Clough.
While they're kind of setting stuff up. While they're setting up, I'd like to say a massive thank you for inviting me out here. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And it's absolutely great to see all that is going on in India. I'm really impressed by what you're doing here, and it's brilliant. And so thank you to the organisers, thank you to Jill for inviting me. Thank you. So I was asked to talk a little bit about kind of users, really, and that was quite a big remit. So I kind of thought, well, what I might talk a little bit about then is what I've called user-informed design to search and discovery in digital cultural heritage. So really, I guess what I wanted to do is provide, first of all, just a very brief motivation for users and why you might want to think about users. And then kind of what I wanted to do is just sort of focus on two areas. I'm not really going to talk about completely how to design the interfaces and so on for users. You know, you'd need hours and hours really to go through that, and there are people far better versed in doing that than me. But I have been interested in a while for a couple of questions really of who uses, for example, digital cultural heritage. So the categories of users together with, well, what are they searching for and why are they searching? So those are going to be the kind of two issues or two questions that I really want to just touch on today. Towards the end, what I want to do is just say a little bit about, well, okay, if we know about users and we know about the context, we know about what they're doing, how could that inform us in our design activities and also our evaluation as well. I'll talk less about evaluation, perhaps a little bit more about design. So just a couple of kind of points to motivate, I guess, really why we might want to focus on users. It's a very good article by Christine Borgman, a well-known person in library and information science, in an interesting article about the digital future, a call to action for the humanities. She gives this quote, so what use are the digital libraries if all they do is put digitally unusable information on the web? So I think that's helpful to kind of highlight, I guess, partly what Jill was saying. If we put the content out there, it has to be usable, okay? Otherwise, what's the point of putting it out there? There's another paper that I find quite helpful. This one was an ACES paper, again talking a little bit more about the user and kind of views of the user. And I like this one. It says we're proposing that it's necessary to look at the users of digital libraries in a more analytical way, and so on. If we are to design digital libraries that meet the needs of diverse user communities, we need to understand what those needs and values are and to incorporate the consequences of those user differences in our collections, interfaces and access tools. So there's a few things in there. We need to understand those needs and the values. What's the value add that people feel that they're getting from the service? And then incorporate, and again questions about that, how do you incorporate the consequences of those user differences into the collections, interfaces and the access tools? And just one other example here, more in the cultural heritage domain. Again, this one, a very good article using AI to access and experience cultural heritage. And, you know, the sort of opening quote here is kind of, you know, cultural heritage involves rich and highly heterogeneous collections. We know that are challenging, we know that as well, to archive, definitely, and convey. And in this case, they're saying to the general public. And when I've looked at kind of cultural heritage, digital cultural heritage over the years, I've certainly seen this push, if you like, to try and open up the collections to those other user groups beyond the expert, beyond the professional, to those kind of novice groups, to those perhaps semi-professional groups, and in this case, to the general public. So this kind of idea of focusing on users, on needs, on task, on context is not new, certainly in the search world and discovery world. Here's one example. This is from Peter Ingerson and Kalavo Jarvelin, who have written a very good book called The Turn. And it was entitled The Turn because it was all about basically turning from focus in information retrieval in search from kind of the technical side into focusing on the users and actually bringing those two sides together. And actually a lot of what goes on in information retrieval at the moment is a combination of those two. It's about understanding users to develop features, functionality, systems that support the users in their kind of work context. So the idea, the model here is just to say, well, you know, we have the search going on at the left there. That's normally the search system where a lot of us tend to focus. but actually that's typically happening in the context of somebody that has an information need. They're doing information seeking where using your system could be only one part of their kind of journey in terms of trying to address that need. And of course, even wider, that often fits in a work task context where people have certain roles, responsibility and constraints, and all of these things will affect then how people use your services and your systems. They will affect how you search. And of course, there's many, many other aspects that would affect how you search. So user differences, age, gender, technical expertise, domain knowledge, cognitive style, and the list goes on, together with the wider context, your task, need, goal, device that you're on. The device you're on will affect how you experience the system, how you use the system, location, time, and all of this importantly does have an aspect on how you go about searching, how you use a system, together with your preferences and your notions of success. So individuals will view success in many, many different ways, which will depend, for example, on the task that they're trying to achieve. So this is sort of driven very much a kind of user-informed approach to design, really. Because if we can understand users' information needs, their context, their situations and so on, it can help us to design systems and importantly I think that support. So I think the aim here is not to replace the user, not to replace people, but to support them, to help them be more effective in what it is they're trying to do. And a couple of quotes, perhaps the most famous, know thy user. Most UX, HCI people kind of will refer to that. It really is about knowing your user. But not only knowing your user, but actually listening to your user and actually making then changes to your systems and services that will reflect what the users want and what they need. So user-centered design techniques can help you with design development, together with things like adaptation, personalization, so you might be adapting your system automatically to specific categories of users, providing features that match, for example, specific categories, and evaluation as well. So there's again quite a body of work at the moment on basically taking kind of what we know about users, taking sort of real search situations and building that in to how we do our evaluation. And a lot of information systems and services are often designed for user categories, perhaps versus individuals and usage situations. So just to sum it up, perhaps in a diagram really, I often see it as kind of going from here of kind of you might start with understanding users in your environment, and you might not start with that. Some people might have already got the development. You might be at the development phase, you haven't really thought about users. So you might go back. The ongoing bit is to say, well, you might then go back and retrofit and think about your users. But often you try to understand users, their environment, do your developments and implementation, which might follow a kind of user-centered design, such as this, which may also involve agile processes, sprints and the like and so on. And then often a point that people perhaps forget is that, well, then once you've got a system that's live and running, like National Digital Library of India, you'll want to do some kind of monitoring and improvement. And again, that's the opportunity to bring the users in again, either through some kind of use of analytics, perhaps using in the way that Jill's talked about in terms of assessing engagement, usage and so on, but maybe also in incorporating user feedback. And again, often that falls back into the loop. You'll then adapt your system services perhaps in response to that. So what I'm going to do is just talk mainly on two different aspects. So one of them in terms of understanding users is sort of characterizing and classifying users in digital cultural heritage. I'm trying not to cite myself, but I've drawn on a couple of pieces of work, mainly because I know that best than kind of other people's work. The papers are available if you want to have a look, because I'm going to have to whiz through it fairly quickly. But there are a couple of studies that we did that helped me think about, if you like, this particular topic. So first one is perhaps just to think about categories of user. Who's the user? Expert, novice, professional, student, and so on. Those are all kind of types of user. This has been looked at kind of generally in the world of kind of certainly search in the wider world as well. And here's one example. This is taken from a very good book called Designing the User Experience by Tony Russell Rose and Tyler Tate. And they kind of walk you through the first bit of understanding the user and the context, and then onto actual features for helping you design for those particular users. And in this view of the user, okay, they describe kind of general categories of users as novices versus expert. That's quite a simple kind of classification. But to kind of get at novices and expert, they have two, if you like, dimensions that they use. So they use domain expertise and then technical expertise. So people at the top right there, double expert, have both technical expertise or technical literacy or information literacy together with domain expertise as well. And of course those people are going to be quite different from the people on the bottom left, who basically don't have any domain expertise and may not be particularly familiar with your system or your search system. And actually, when you look at the kind of usage and the users, you might actually be finding that you're trying to attract a lot more of those novices. And of course, the way that they work and the types of features that you need to support them are quite different. And over time, experience can shift people. And actually what you're doing, perhaps if you're trying to build a system that's helping people learn, is that often you're trying to take people going from novices to experts, and that comes through experience and their use of the system and familiarity with the subject. So there have been many, many articles written in kind of cultural heritage and digital cultural heritage and library and information science more generally that kind of discuss users and categories of users and types of users. And the sorts of dimensions you often see are things like the ones I've mentioned before: expertise, profession, role, motivation or goal. These are often been ways to kind of group or categorize users. And often we see the user and their kind of task and their scenario presented and captured as an example here of a persona. So earlier Mickey took us through a usage scenario that she gave us of people using Microsoft Academic. Here's a usage scenario for the UK National Archives and the services they provide. This is the government web archive. And what you get is effectively a user, a kind of a sort of little story about them. Here are their characteristics or dimensions of which you rate the user, so you get a feeling for kind of what experiences they have and so on. And this becomes a stereotype, a kind of category against which you could then design your systems rather than using individuals. And this type, so in the case of the UK Government Web Archive, this was built upon a number of different sources of data, including focus groups, interviews, analysis of transactional data, and so on, to arrive at these kind of user stories or these personas. So here's just one very brief summary of a bit of work we did. So we're interested in, one way of understanding users would be just to kind of survey the literature, do kind of a systematic literature review. And so we did this, and we tried to identify papers or articles where basically people had described groups and they'd given names to the groups. And I guess the intent from this was to say, well, how big is the list? Do people always use the same groups? Expert, novice, librarian versus student, and so on, or are there many? And we didn't do a kind of a massive review here. It's a fairly short one, just for a workshop paper. And of course, we found fairly broad categories of user: professionals, experts, semi-experts, hobbyists, and so on. Interestingly, with descriptions, so we can provide descriptions of those as well. But actually, in practice, there are over 58 distinct names. These were different labels, different names for groups of people. And part of the problem becomes, well, are they all the same? I mean, if you're studying and you're trying to compare groups, is the novice the same as the lay user, is the same as a casual leisure user? Are they just different names for the same type of user? And that's where you come back to the dimensions, because one way of comparing your users would be on the dimensions. So let me then talk about another study. So that was based really on a kind of survey of the literature. Another piece of work that we've been doing, and this has been as a part of a PhD project that I have with a student who works at a university in Liverpool. He's been working with National Museums Liverpool, and they're a fairly big outfit. They've very much taken a sort of a step into the digital world. Yes, they have a fancy website where you can purchase items, you can get information about the kind of the physical museums, such as opening times, but they also have functionality to search the collections that they have, and they do have fairly extensive collections. So as an institution, they're really interested in terms of what are people doing, especially on the physical. What are they searching on our website? What types of things are they looking for? So we conducted a study where we were trying to sort of identify not only the categories of users, but which is the most kind of frequent group. So for the museum, that's kind of helpful in terms of who do we target. We've only got so much money, which typically in the UK case is not really very much money at all in the cultural heritage sector. Therefore, we need to make the most of our resources. So are there certain groups that we may want to target? One of the things that they were particularly interested in was the notion of the general public. And when you look at the literature on general public, often cited as a very popular group, but who on earth is the general public? And so they were interested in looking at that group, general public, together with the group that they know that they get a lot of interest in, the non-professional. And by non-professional, we often mean the amateur historian, the genealogist, the person who's really interested in history and wouldn't class themselves necessarily as general public because they perhaps have a little bit more domain knowledge. So the way that we try to gather information on this is we basically carried out an online survey, a kind of pop-up survey. That's a form of intercept survey. Ran it for 4 weeks, and we did ask people to identify themselves to groups. So we basically used the groups that we'd already found from the literature. We asked people to assign themselves to one of those groups, and we had a description of the group. We defined the groups, and they said you could also, be other if you want to. We asked people to rate themselves against a number of dimensions, things like domain knowledge, and so on. You get the idea that actually what we can start to do is say which of these dimensions, which of these characteristics partly describe these groups. That's kind of useful information. We also gathered information on the tasks that they were there to perform, their motivation, and so on. When we basically analysed the data, we were left with 564 responses, and interestingly enough, the general public and the non-professional groups, actually they made up around 70% of the responses. So a lot of people class themselves general public are using the site, and that to the museum makes a lot of sense. These are people who are going for a visit with a family, they're general public, they just want to find out when the place is open and so on. But interestingly enough, these also relate quite well to the bounce groups. When you look at the logs and you look at the people who come in and go out, they typically actually match quite well to this general public and non-professional groups. What we did with this, and you can read a lot more in the paper that we wrote, we basically tried to sort of identify through statistical analysis which are the similar groups, which are the different groups, what characteristics, what features are specific to certain groups. And this is the sort of thing we ended up with. So here, for example, is the kind of list of the groups. So you can see general public, and if you look at the merged, what we tried to do, so people could assign themselves to more than one group. And that's interesting because people will come to you with more than one role. You might be a historian, but at this point in time, you're actually a novice because you're learning about an area that you don't really have much expertise, or you're just passing time. It's your dinner break. So we allowed people to categorise themselves. People didn't really do that too much, so a lot of them were there really in kind of one specific role. But you can see the general public, non-professional groups really are in this particular instance, and this is one survey. It can't be comprehensive. We think it represents the population when you compare it with some of the log statistics from the transaction logs. But of course, it's just one sample, and you would need to do several to really validate this. But basically through this type of exercise, you can build up a fairly complete picture of your users. And in terms of user groups, again, what we tried to do is basically a comparison between general public and the non-professional versus everyone else. So we were looking for features that basically were, if you like, indicative or could describe the different groups. And we also tried to look at the differences between the general public and the non-professional group. So for example, you look at the students typically identify that they're there to study. So that's their kind of motivation. They would class themselves mainly as novice, intermediate, versus the museum staff who are there for work purposes, intermediate, expert. The local bit indicates their distance, their proximity from the physical museum. So a lot of museum staff are local because they either work in the museum or work in some of the local museums. Versus the kind of general public, non-professional, general public typically there for personal reasons and to pass time. And that's interesting. How on earth do you serve a user who's just there to pass time and have a bit of fun? They're a completely different demographic from the museum staff who are there to work and basically want to get things done as quickly as possible. So again, understanding the users, understanding these kind of dimensions, the characteristics, is really helpful, really, really important. I guess the other thing I wanted to think about then was just what do people search for when they use systems like this, and how do they search and why? So I guess part of the problem with the other survey is that it was quite general. It was just mainly asking about the groups and that. But one of the things I'm particularly interested in is the kind of what are people typically searching for in the everyday world? What do we search for? We're using Google, we're using Bing and so on all the time, but what are we searching for? So there's a couple of kind of pieces to this that I'll show you, again based upon a couple of papers that you're free to pick up, or I can send you copies afterwards. So the first way that you might find about users and what they're searching for is the age-old and the very common kind of transaction log analysis. Okay, so when you interact with systems like the National Digital Library of India or with Microsoft Academic, Bing, Google, Europeana, you're effectively leaving a trace behind. Okay, and the service that's offering that can basically use that data, and there's lots of valuable stuff you can do with the data, including learn about your users. And of course, what's really interesting is that they're actually giving you the queries. They're giving you what it is they're searching for. Okay, rather than it being an information need, it's kind of the actual query itself. However, there are lots and lots of issues and challenges with using logs, and I've put a few of them here. There are many, many more that you'll come across. So the most obvious one is that transaction logs tell you what people are doing. You can look at the queries they're searching, the things they click on and so on, but you don't know why. What's the intent behind that? What's their motivation, which we were asking in that online survey before? We don't know, unless you complement this with an instrument where you can ask people. Maybe some pop-up survey where you can record the logs and you could ask them, what are you here for? There's got to be huge issues around privacy and ethics. Okay, this information is being used potentially to kind of inform the design of systems and so on. People don't often know that that data is being used. My experience has been that you often need to complement the log data analysis with more in-depth studies to try and understand what's going on, together with different forms of kind of data collection as well. So log data, you often want to match it and use other forms of data collection, surveys, focus groups and so on, to build up a complete view of your user. Another issue that I found quite challenging is identifying non-human traffic. So bot traffic, the traffic that comes from kind of aggregators or crawlers and so on. Because the problem with that is that it's not reflective of real users. Typically, they're bot users and you might want to distinguish them. Together with, if you like, real queries. So in a lot of systems, and even systems like Europeana, the features, the functionality, the way it's implemented, basically generate what look like queries in the logs. But actually they come from preset queries. They're things like the filters and so on. Again, you want to recognize those in your logs because they're not necessarily organic queries as such. And then the other challenge is often, and it's a little bit easier this, but you often want to distinguish site search versus referral. So you might often think, oh, we're getting some really interesting queries here. It's not actually in your site. It's actually because somebody's searching in Google in a very general purpose search engine or Bing, and it's being referred to you. Okay, so it's not actually entered within your site. Okay, so there's lots of tools that could help you with this. Here's Google Analytics as one example, and provides you certain information about your users, and actually is quite comprehensive. You can analyze your audience, you can look at queries, you can look at sessions, you can look at durations, the sort of typical web analytics, web usage stuff. But let me just briefly give you one other example that we did with the UK National Archives. They had the web analytics stuff, but they wanted to know a little bit more about users. And there's only a limit to what you can get from some of the web analytics tools. So what we did is we did some work with them where they basically gave 10 years worth of web server logs from a number of databases or services that they have. Discovery is their discovery system that searches across different catalogues, and they have many in the UK National Archives, the bookshop, the website, databases and so on. And so what we tried to do is both the kind of usual web analytics stuff, so session length, number of clicks, number of users, that type of stuff, together with a bit more more in-depth analysis, mainly to identify things like certain types of queries. So how many queries, for example, are people names, that type of thing, which you wouldn't get normally from a tool like Google Analytics, together with looking at what we might call a session, so looking at somebody's activity throughout their journey on the site. So what did they search? Have they queried, researched? Have they clicked on things and so on? So I'll just show you a couple of examples. Sorry if you can't see these too well, but so when you do the analysis, so one analysis we did was looking at the queries that come from different countries. And again, that was interesting to the National Archives because they're there actually to serve a very broad audience. And actually, again, country affects information seeking, affects information behaviour. Okay, where you're from will affect typically what you're searching. So in China, for example, the top query is UFO. The National Archives actually contains quite a lot of information about UFOs. And then China, Shanghai economic blockade. Compared to Australia, where UFO was a bit lower with Alec Mark Bernard. That was the most popular query. Other things you can do, so again, National Archives have name authority files, and of course we can use those where we can, in this case, look for prominent people. So for example, the most prominent people searched for in this case was Henry VIII. Okay, so you can do that sort of analysis, which again helps you understand a little bit more about your users. Other things we were able to do, we looked at different types of queries. So how many questions are people asking in a search box? You've just got a little white search box. People often do questions. And in the case of the National Archives, there were quite a lot of questions. Who was Henry VIII? That type of thing. And again, when you're thinking about design of the system, this might affect, if you had a lot of questions, you might think, okay, I need to handle that in a different way. We don't just think of this as kind of standard keywords. The other thing we did was a kind of named entity extraction. So we looked for kind of entities, and we've heard quite a lot about entities at the moment. And again, what's interesting is that once we've done the entity extraction, so person, for example, or people are commonly looked for in the National Archives, as you would expect. Person is a very, very common entity that's looked for. But what's interesting is then you can dig a bit deeper and look at things like particular catalogues. Particular services have certain types of queries that are being fired at them. So, for example, the site search is all sorts of queries, whereas documents online is mainly people. Therefore, you might design features and so on specifically for even subparts of that particular application. And just one final example, again, the National Archives were interested in kind of countries. And so again, we did this kind of country analysis, and again, we're interested in, and I'm particularly interested in kind of how people search their interaction, the kind of patterns of searching. So a very common thing to do is look at the way that people formulate and reformulate queries. And in this little study, it's only a fairly small piece of work, but we basically took a bunch of a sample of data, we took sessions, and then we actually manually analysed the sessions for queries, types of queries, whether they're names of people, places, and so on. But then we looked specifically at how people were reformulating. Okay, so sometimes people will generalise the query, sometimes they'll specialise the query, sometimes they have to fix the query. And often we see fixing going on. So the modal path thing on here is actually showing you the most kind of common, if you like, sort of sequence of activities. So N represents a new query, and then the R represents a revision, which is typically that the system wasn't handling misspellings. And you can see, particularly in some countries like Central America, there's huge chains of revision going on, and the person probably doesn't even end up being satisfied. Again, this sort of analysis can inform your thinking and identify problems on the system. And then one other study that I just wanted to mention, I couldn't really not mention, was a study that we've done with Europeana. And I'd like to say again, thank you to Jill and Europeana for supporting us with this work. And this was a study with also Timothy Hill from Europeana. So it was nice to have somebody directly involved to inform our thinking on this. So we've heard quite a lot about Europeana. The goal of this study really was that there's an awful lot of really brilliant information that's already been compiled in Europeana on the users and who the users are. They have very comprehensive personas and kind of profiles of the users and so on. But kind of one of the areas that felt perhaps a little lacking was actually more again on my interest, what actually are people searching for in terms of what are their search tasks? So when somebody comes to Europeana, what's the search task that they're trying to carry out? Is it known item? Is it a topical search? And then what is it they're actually trying to do? So do they want to use the work to create a presentation? Do they want to use it perhaps in a setting, a family history genealogy setting? So we basically again created another pop-up survey. So this is a survey that as people are using Europeana would come up, and they have the option to participate or not. Again, there's lots of issues around designing these types of survey. One of them is the choice of tools that you can use. You might be constrained, but also you can't bombard people with 100 questions, even though you'd love to. You'd love to dig inside their minds and find out what they're doing, but you really can't do that. You have to keep things quite short. So in this particular case, we ran a survey for a couple of weeks, got 240 responses, with a sample of users that generally represent the users of the portal. So these aren't all the user groups that Jill has previously talked about. These were just people who used the portal who also agreed to participate. So again, this is a kind of, if you like, a bit of a biased sample. We always have to remember that. Ideally, you'd be running this several times to get a complete view. But let me just show you a little bit about what we did there. So here's a kind of basic demographic. So as opposed to something like the National Museum's Liverpool, in this case, in Europeana, very few kind of, if you like, general public type of user. Many academics, because actually a lot of academics are engaging using Europeana, together with the cultural heritage enthusiast. Again, these people who might be the amateur historian, the family historian, the genealogist, and so on. And then we get a lot of people also whose visit is first time. So we were seeing quite a lot of academics who also were coming to Europeana for the first time, partly through some of the marketing that was going on social media, bringing people in. And again, that's something you could look at. I'm sorry that this is so small, okay, and I'm just going to explain one example. You can actually download the data if you want to look at it yourself, but this is kind of what we got. And again, we left people to describe for themselves what is it you're doing. So The one in red is just the one I'll read out to you. So in terms of what information you're looking for, okay, I want working women images and videos from the 20th century. That's their search task. Why are you looking for the information, your motivation and use? I want to create a video about women in Europe during the 20th century. So again, that's really rich. When you look through this, we've actually got a rich set of information that tells us what are people actually trying to do. What was the user doing as they were trying to engage with Europeana? So we did a range of analysis on this. One of them, a fairly classic one, trying to do an analysis of the search task. So is it a kind of known item task versus a topical search? And, again, the sorts of things we learn is that people are doing an awful lot of general topical searching. And again, think about that for the design of your kind of features. Well, therefore, you might want facets, subject categories, to allow people to browse across those subjects. In terms of motivation and use, again, we tried to find a scheme to basically use out of the box. We couldn't find one, so we created one for this. And again, this was really about asking people's motivation, their use. And we actually found quite a large proportion of people who are using Europeana. They were there trying to find stuff to create new work. And often that work was basically around things like creating a presentation. So they want to find an image, use it in a presentation for the class. Or they want an image or they want a text that they're going to use in a publication or scholarly research. So again, we were able to do this type of analysis with the data. Okay, so that's the studies. I guess the final bit that I need to wrap up with is to think about then how can all of that help us in terms of designing for the user. So I guess when I was thinking about this, I thought, well, in terms of trying to understand users, search and discovery, you might be trying to ask a series of questions. And I'll try to think of as many as I can, but you might be trying to find out, well, who are your users? What do they want to do? So that's their needs and tasks. Why are they trying to do it? That's your goals, motivations. How are they doing it? That's your behaviours. And then how would they like to do it? So that's often it doesn't work and I need features to help me. And how well have they done it? Okay, those are the sorts of things you might be trying to find out. User-informed design evaluation can help us to basically build better systems to support the user. So we build features, functionalities, provide data, services, collections that help the user. And just in terms of how do we integrate it, well, I would say integrate it in terms of we need to understand how people search. We need to understand information seeking. So here's one example of how people search. And we integrate this with the knowledge that we know about users. So we know, for example, that domain knowledge is really important when it comes to formulating your queries. That could be a sticking point for some people as they're searching using a system like Europeana. But the important thing is, remember, this is micro. And actually the macro is bigger in the sense of what's people's bigger goal. So again, this was a study that we did looking at family history searching to actually identify the bigger goal. So I guess the thing I really want to highlight is that something like family history is a lifelong activity that people come back to again and again. People may come back to your collections, your sites again and again during the course of their activity. And the important thing for family history, it's about learning. Well, if it's about learning, what does your site offer to facilitate and support knowledge discovery and learning? Do you have features that help you with learning? And again, what's interesting is that we found specific sites that are used at specific points in the process. So where is Europeana used in the wider research process? Where is Microsoft Academic used in the wider research process, scholarly process? It helps to understand that big picture. If you really want to know how to build systems informed by users, I recommend these two great books. The first one is by somebody that Mickey's already mentioned, Ryan White from Microsoft, a leading scholar in interactive search. Fantastic, and he's written this book, Interaction with Search Systems, that tells you what features would help people explore, to learn, and so on. And then this is a great book, more for practitioners, but very accessible, by Tony Russell-Rose, Designing the Search Experience from the User Perspective. I'll leave you with a final quote here. And I like this one, Mitchell Whitelaw. Decades of digitisation have made a wealth of digital cultural material available online, yet search, the dominant interface to these collections, is incapable of representing this abundance. Search is ungenerous. So what he argues for is a generous interface, an interface that doesn't constrain your user by your search box, that enables you to explore in the same way that Mickey was talking about in Microsoft Academic, and some of the ways that Jill was talking about the features and functions of Europeana. So build your systems for generous interfaces. Thank you.
we have some time for questions.
Great questions.
This was absolutely wonderful. Let me ask you the question. Will you do a study about Microsoft Academic?
Yeah, I mean, I think studies already look very much at scholarly communication, definitely. But I'd love to, yeah. I think that'd be very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. Okay. The question over there.
Perhaps not so much a question, but I should tell you something about last half hour. I was upstairs for the interview with the organizers of this event. And there my remark was, before your contribution here, that I think it's very difficult and very ambitious of the project managers here, because on the one side they clearly want to develop a system that supports education. I should say support learning, of course, the user-centered learning, which is ambitious in itself, which is very good, very interesting project. But I've also seen that you want, or that the organizers, the developers of the system, they want to incorporate, for instance, heritage information in relation to the rich heritage, historical heritage, political heritage, cultural heritage of your country, which is again very nice. But I think you already understand my question or my point. Unifying all this for all these very different kind of users in one system is clearly very ambitious. I think you pointed this out also, as I did in my interview. And the question is how to support or how to help the developers of the system in making something that is attractive for everybody. I'm sure we all agree that this is very ambitious.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess there are a couple of points there. I mean, there's a whole debate around the notion of personalisation and to what extent you personalise towards an individual versus, say, a stereotype or a group. I guess the other thing I've been thinking about is, and certainly I guess picked up from Jill's talk, is, you know, the sort of the driver towards providing the API. If you provide the API, suddenly people can do what they want. So therefore, people could build their own applications that create a toolkit in their specific kind of domain, rather than you as a provider think you've got to do everything. Because actually I think providing a one-fits-all solution is really, really difficult. Although that's typically what the people provide. And I guess one approach is you provide such a range of functionality that hopefully you'll please everybody. But again, you know, we know, so I did a study with WorldCat, with the AHRC, and it was really interesting there. What we found is that basically WorldCat thought that recommendations would be brilliant and we should roll it out, and they thought that they wanted to roll it out generally on the WorldCat system. Sorry, OCLC did. And actually when we talked to the users, what we found is that the student groups thought fantastic. You know, when we ran focus groups, we did surveys and so on, the student groups thought brilliant. You know, recommendations, they could see all the value. You talk to maybe the librarians or the cataloguers, they would know, what on earth would we need that recommendations for, that functionality? It would get in the way. In fact, it would be completely annoying and it would make our job longer and harder. So again, you wouldn't want to basically maybe include that feature for that particular user group. But I think it's a real challenge and it's really hard to know what to do because we have, as we've seen, so many diverse user groups. So I like the API approach because I think it opens up the ability to create apps which could be kind of apps in a workflow for your specific domain, potentially. Yeah.
May I immediately reply that of course your answer is correct, it's good. You give as much freedom to the user as you want, and in a technical way it's providing the API. Yeah. But if the basic indexing, for instance, just as an example, is not full text, then you can never expect that through the API you can delve into the historical documents. So in that case the API will not really solve the basic problem.
Yeah. I think the example we found with looking at the family historian and the genealogist is that in a domain like that you've got so many different collections, and actually some of the collections will never be publicly available. They're owned by private companies and worth an awful lot of money, and there are companies in the UK like Ancestry and so on that give features and services to support the group. And I think for me it was striking just that actually specific resources are only used in specific places. I don't think you could ever bring them all together in one place. It wouldn't really work. Although potentially you could provide tools or a toolkit or something that might help people partway through the process. But I do think there is a role for very independent kind of collections, and you can't always aggregate them together.
Thank you very much. I believe we are out of time. Thank you very much, Dr. Clough. Excellent presentation. And thank you, very well deserved.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So our next has already been